I spent 38 years in the trades, and I can tell you one thing for certain, a house will always show you what it's made of. You strip back the drywall, pull up the subfloor, and the truth is right there. Doesn't lie, doesn't fake excuses. It's either solid or it isn't. People are the same way. I just took too long to do the stripping back. My name is Frank. No, wait, my name is Henry Bouchard, and I'm 63 years old, a retired electrician from Sudbury, Ontario, and until about 14 months ago, I thought I had a family. I was wrong. I married my wife, Sylvia, when we were both 26. She was a teacher's assistant at the time, had this laugh that could fill a whole room. We bought our first house on Lawrence Street for $87,000. I did most of the renovation work myself, weekends and evenings after long shifts. We raised 2 kids in that house. My son, who I'll call by what he is now, which is a stranger, and my daughter, who married a man named, and I'll call him what he is too, a leech in a button-down shirt. For the sake of this story, I'll call my son-in-law exactly what my old foreman used to call guys like him, a finisher. The kind of guy who shows up right when the hard work is done and acts like he built the whole thing himself. My daughter met him at a networking event in Toronto about 6 years ago. He worked in what he called financial consulting, which, as far as I could tell, meant he charged people money to tell them things they already knew. He drove a leased BMW, wore watches that cost more than my first truck. And from the moment he shook my hand, he looked at me the way people look at furniture they're waiting to inherit. My son, for his part, had moved back home at 31 after his second failed business venture, something involving an app that was going to disrupt the home renovation industry, which I found personally insulting given that I'd spent 4 decades in the actual home renovation industry. He paid no rent, contributed nothing to the groceries, and spent most of his time on his laptop in my basement, occasionally surfacing to ask if I could front him some capital for his next idea. Sylvia thought this was fine. She always thought it was fine. Whatever the kids needed, they got. And I don't say this with bitterness. I was the same way for a long time. I worked extra shifts through the 90s when things were tight. Took on side jobs in my 50s to help my daughter with her tuition. Co-signed my son's lease on his first apartment, paid it off when he walked away from it. The point is, I love them, not as an investment, just because they were mine. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, maybe, was that somewhere along the way the arrangement had shifted. I had become useful, and useful is a very different thing from loved. It was my heart that showed me the difference. It was a Thursday evening in late October. I remember because I'd been raking leaves in the backyard, which I still did myself because I'm stubborn, and because it was my yard and I liked the quiet of it. I'd been having some discomfort in my chest on and off for a couple weeks. Figured it was the cold air, or maybe I'd pulled something. The kind of thing a man my age tells himself to avoid thinking about the other thing. I was on my second pass along the fence line when the pain changed. That's the only way I can describe it. It changed. Like someone reached into my chest and grabbed something essential and just squeezed. I made it to the back porch steps and sat down hard. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I called Sylvia first. She didn't pick up. I called my daughter. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted, and I told her I thought something was wrong with my heart. She said, "Dad, we're in the middle of dinner. Can this wait?" I said I didn't think it could. She said she'd call her brother and they'd figure something out. I called 911 myself. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. I know this because I counted. It's the kind of thing you count when you're sitting on your back porch in October, wondering if you're going to see November. I did not see my family at the hospital that night. What I learned later, pieced together from things my neighbor Carol mentioned and from texts I wasn't meant to see, was that my son-in-law had organized a dinner at Mambo Cucina, a restaurant in the city, to celebrate a deal he'd supposedly closed. My daughter was there. My son was there. Sylvia was there. They had the burrata and the osso buco, and they split 2 bottles of a Barolo that, according to the receipt I found later in my son-in-law's jacket pocket when I was doing laundry, cost $240. The nurse who admitted me, a young woman named, I think, Danielle, from her badge, told me she had reached my wife. She told me Sylvia had said she would come in the morning, that she didn't like driving at night. I was in the cardiac unit. I had a stent procedure at 2 in the morning. I lay in that bed with an IV in my arm and a monitor beeping beside me. And I stared at the ceiling tiles, and I thought, 37 years. 37 years of marriage, and she doesn't like driving at night. My neighbor Carol was there. She'd seen the ambulance from across the street, followed it to the hospital, and sat in the waiting room for 3 hours until they told her I was stable. She brought me a Tim Hortons double-double the next morning. She cried a little when she saw me, which is more than I can say for anyone with my last name. My family arrived at 11 the following morning, together in my son-in-law's BMW. He had a coffee from somewhere. My daughter hugged me briefly and said it was lucky I'd called when I did. My son looked at his phone. Sylvia sat in the chair by the window and said the hospital parking was brutal. Nobody said sorry. Nobody said they should have come. Nobody said much of anything that mattered. My son-in-law asked at one point whether I had updated my will recently. He framed it as concern. He said he just wanted to make sure everything was in order. He said it in a gentle voice, head tilted slightly, the way financial consultants learn to say difficult things. I told him everything was in order. That was when I started making sure it was. The thing about spending decades in the trades is that you develop a certain relationship with problems. You don't panic, you assess. You figure out what's actually broken and what just looks broken, and then you fix what needs fixing and walk away from what doesn't. My cardiologist, Dr. Mehta, was a compact and serious man who explained things with the precision of someone who had given the same speech many times and still meant it every single time. He told me I needed 4 to 6 weeks of recovery, no heavy lifting, limited stress. He told me the procedure had gone well. He told me I was fortunate. I thanked him and asked him to please not share any further updates with my family without my explicit permission. He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded. I spent 9 days in that hospital. Carol visited every second day. She brought crossword books. She watched Jeopardy with me on the mounted TV and argued with the contestants. She is 71 years old, a widow, and she has lived next door to me for 22 years, and I realized somewhere around day 5 that she was the closest thing I had to someone who actually gave a damn. Sylvia came twice. The second time, she mentioned that she needed the PIN for our joint account because she was going to need her hair done before my son-in-law's birthday celebration the following weekend. The celebration was being held at a venue they'd rented in Barrie. A proper event, catered, open bar, DJ. My son-in-law was turning 40, and apparently 40 warranted a party that cost, as I calculated later from the invoices, somewhere around $9,000. When I asked how this was being funded, Sylvia looked at me with that particular expression she'd developed over the years, a kind of patient weariness, as if my asking financial questions was a charming but slightly embarrassing habit, and she said the kids were handling it. The kids, my daughter who hadn't come to the hospital, my son who was living in my basement, those kids. I told her the PIN was the same as always. Then I called my bank from my hospital room and had my accounts restructured. This is where I should explain something. During my working years, I had been careful. Not wealthy. I was an electrician from Sudbury, not a Bay Street banker, but careful. The house on Lorne Street was paid off. I had RRSPs. I had a modest TFSA. I had a pension from my years with the IBEW local. Sylvia had access to a joint checking account we used for household expenses. But the savings, the investments, the property, those were mine, in my name, carefully so, not out of suspicion, just out of what my father used to call basic sense. I called my old friend and hockey buddy, a man I'd known since we were both 17 and playing for the same Nickel Belt League team. His name was Gary, and he was now a semi-retired lawyer in North Bay, and I told him what had happened, not just the health scare. All of it, the party, the hospital, the pin question, the birthday event, the will question from my son-in-law. Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How do you want to handle this, Henry?" I told him. He said, "That's going to be thorough." I said, "Yes." What I did over the following 3 weeks, from my hospital bed and then from the spare bedroom I moved into at home under the guise of needing quiet to recover, was methodical. Gary handled the legal side, I handled the rest. The joint checking account was closed and replaced with a sole account in my name. The household expenses I transferred to a prepaid account that gave Sylvia access to enough for groceries and utilities. Nothing more. The property title, which had been in both our names since we'd refinanced in 2009, was something Gary said we'd address properly through formal separation proceedings. But in the meantime, he advised me to document everything. I documented everything. My son's rent-free arrangement in the basement came with an informal understanding that he could stay as long as he was working on something. I had never put this in writing, which turned out to be entirely in my favor. Gary drafted a formal notice, 60 days, as required under Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act, even for informal arrangements, and I slipped it under the basement door on a Tuesday morning. My son came upstairs 20 minutes later, looking like I'd thrown cold water on him. He said I couldn't do that. I told him Gary's number was on the notice if he had questions. He called his mother instead. Sylvia came into the kitchen and told me I was being cruel. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee and reading the paper, which is what I do every morning. I looked up at her. I said, "He's 32 years old, Sylvia." She left the room. My daughter called that afternoon. She said she'd heard what was going on and that she thought maybe I wasn't thinking clearly since the surgery. I asked her how the birthday party planning was going. She said that wasn't the point. I asked whether she remembered which night she'd been planning it. She hung up. Here is the part of the story where people always want to know. Was I angry? The honest answer is no, not by then. There had been anger, yes, lying in that hospital bed on the first night, listening to the monitor alone, that had been anger. But by the time I was making phone calls and reviewing documents and talking to Gary, what I felt was something much quieter. A kind of clarity, the same feeling I used to get when I finally identified the fault in a circuit. Everything stops buzzing. You see exactly where the break is. The break in this case had been there for a long time. I'd just been too busy being useful to notice it. The birthday party went ahead. I was not there. Obviously, I was home 2 hours away, eating leftover soup Carol had brought over and watching the hockey game. My son attended. My daughter and son-in-law were the hosts. Sylvia went, wearing a dress she'd bought with the last withdrawal from the joint account before I closed it. I heard about the party secondhand. Carol knew someone who knew someone. There had been a moment, apparently around midnight, when my daughter tried to use the credit card linked to our household account to cover the bar tab, and the card had declined. She tried twice. Then she called me. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 40 seconds long and mostly consisted of my daughter's voice climbing several registers while she explained that there must be some kind of mistake, and could I please call the bank right away because this was embarrassing. I listened to it the next morning with my coffee. There was a follow-up call from my son-in-law, more measured in tone, but with a distinct edge, suggesting that he hoped there hadn't been some confusion around the accounts and that we should sit down as a family to discuss things. I let that go to voicemail too. The following week, Gary filed the formal separation documents. Ontario is a no-fault province for divorce purposes, and given that we had been effectively estranged under the same roof for some time, the process was straightforward. The matrimonial home was assessed at $640,000. My pension and RRSPs were the primary assets. Gary negotiated a settlement structure that was fair, legally speaking, while ensuring that none of it passed through my sons-in-law's hands in any form whatsoever, which had been my primary concern from the beginning. My son moved out to a friend's place in mid-December. He took his laptop and his coffee maker and left the basement in a state that took me an afternoon to clean. I did not feel bad about this. I felt, if anything, a small and specific satisfaction. The satisfaction of a space returned to what it should have been. What I want to be clear about is this. I did not do any of this out of revenge. I want to say that plainly because I think people sometimes hear stories like this and assume it's about punishment. It wasn't. It was about accuracy, about correcting an error I had been allowing for too long. But I will admit that what happened next did give me something adjacent to satisfaction. My son-in-law had been, for several years, running what Gary eventually described to me as a fee-harvesting arrangement, not technically illegal on its face, but operating in a gray area that certain regulatory bodies take an interest in. He had a handful of clients, mostly older people, mostly in the Simcoe County area, who were paying him ongoing advisory fees for services that were not materially being rendered. One of his clients was a man named, and this is public record now, a retired pharmacist in Collingwood who had been paying $2,200 a month for 14 months for investment guidance that had resulted in no investments. I had known about this for almost 2 years. I had known because my son-in-law was sloppy with documents. He left things on the printer. He took calls in rooms he thought were empty that weren't. I had said nothing because, and I recognize this now, as a failure of character on my part. I was still hoping the situation would resolve itself, that my daughter would see him clearly, that things would somehow be different than they were. After the night of the birthday party, I sent everything I had, printed documents, dates, names, dollar figures, to the Ontario Securities Commission. I did not do this dramatically. I did not do this as the opening move in some elaborate revenge sequence. I did it because it was the right thing to do and because I'd waited too long already. The OSC opened a formal inquiry in January. I was not involved in that process beyond providing my initial documentation. Gary advised me to let it proceed without further intervention from me, and I did. The inquiry became an investigation. The investigation resulted in a hearing. The hearing resulted in a finding of misconduct, a fine of $68,000, and a 5-year ban from operating in any advisory capacity in Ontario. My son-in-law did not go to jail. I want to be fair about that. What he did was wrong, but it was wrong in the way that a lot of things done by men in good shoes and leased cars are wrong. Just over the line, not quite past the point of criminal. What he lost was his practice, his reputation, and, as I understand it, the lease on the BMW. My daughter called me when the news became public. She was crying. She said she didn't understand how this had happened. She said she felt blindsided. I told her I was sorry she was going through a hard time. She said, "Dad, were you involved in?" I told her that the OSC acted on information submitted by various parties and that I wasn't in a position to speak to their investigative process. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I should have come to the hospital." I told her yes, she should have. That was the last real conversation we had for several months. I'm not going to pretend that was easy. Whatever happened between me and my daughter's husband, she is still my daughter. That part doesn't resolve cleanly. I don't think it's supposed to. I sold the house on Lorne Street in March. 31 years in that house. I did a lot of the work myself before the listing, replaced the trim in the front hallway, refinished the deck, upgraded the panel. Took me 3 weeks. The house sold in 4 days. $42,000 over asking. Carol cried when the sign went up. I almost did too. I bought a smaller place on the outskirts of Perry Sound, on a lake, with a shop in the back where I can work on things. Small jobs, stuff that interests me. An old friend from the union, a man named, well, he's new to this story, so I'll just call him my old friend, reached out when he heard I'd relocated, and we've been playing cards on Thursday evenings ever since. I turned 64 in April. Carol drove up for the weekend. She brought a butter tart from the bakery on Elgin Street because she knows I don't like cake. We ate it on the dock and watched the loons. I don't hear from my son much. Occasionally a text, nothing substantive. He's working at a warehouse in Mississauga now, which I think is the best thing for him, honestly. He needs to understand what work actually feels like before he goes back to disrupting any industries. My daughter and I have spoken a few times. Carefully. There's distance there that I think will take a long time to close, if it closes at all. She left her husband last summer. I didn't ask her to. I didn't celebrate it. She told me on a Sunday phone call in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, and I told her I was sorry and that I was there if she needed anything. She said, "You always were, Dad?" I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. What I'll tell you is this. The lake is cold in the mornings, the way Ontario lakes always are. Even in July, I wake up early because I always have. I make coffee, I sit on the dock, and I watch the mist come off the water. It's quiet in a way that the house in Sudbury never quite was. A man spends his whole life building things. Sometimes what he builds holds. Sometimes you pull back the drywall and find out the studs were rotting all along, but sometimes, if you're paying attention, you can strip it all back. Start from solid ground. Build it right this time. That's what I'm doing.